Good afternoon. It's Thursday, March 23rd, and as I promised in our Zoom conference, I wanted to get a video posted today. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run through some of the important points in chapters 30 and 31 of Decker's Reading Koine Greek. And rather than using a PowerPoint, I've just kind of highlighted the text, the electronic text that I've got. And so chapter 30 is on syntax and formal conditions. As I mentioned in our Zoom conference today, that is mainly what I'm going to focus in on as we work through these two chapters. Chapter 31 is on informal conditions, and so we'll look at some of the categories and some of the examples that are given. But most of what I will want you to really drill down on and understand and know is in chapter 30. So formal conditions, we want to scroll down here and catch some important terms. Two key terms that we've got, protasis and apodosis. Probably you have not run across those words very frequently in your work up until now. The protasis is the if statement. The apodosis is the then statement, okay? So as you can see, the protasis is the if part of the statement and forms the subordinate clause. That might be a key term there. The apodosis is the then part of the sentence and is the main clause in the statement. Okay. Probably you won't want to pay attention to the sentence diagrams. And this chart in section 30.4 is kind of important because actually in Greek we've got four classes of conditional statements. The first three are listed for you here because the first three are the ones that are found in the New Testament itself. So a first-class conditional sentence, a simple logical connection. In the protasis, we will have the particle e plus the indicative. In the apodosis, any verb form goes. Okay, and so e with the indicative is the important thing right there. Second-class conditional sentence, assumed to be contrary to fact. Sometimes these will just be called a contrary to fact condition, and there's a special formula that is used for this where you have the same particle e and a past tense. That's what secondary form means. Verb in the indicative, that is in the protasis. In the apodosis, you will also have a past tense form of an indicative verb, and sometimes you'll have this subjunctive or contingent-like particle on. You do not have to have on. If you have e and a past tense indicative in the protasis and a past tense indicative in the apodosis, that may be a second-class conditional sentence. The third-class conditional sentence is a simple logical connection, but what you've got in this form is you've got the particle, conditional particle eon, if, plus a verb in the subjunctive in the protasis. And so those are the first, second, and third class conditional sentences. This chart is kind of important. It's kind of gold. You may want to refer back to that, section 30.4. There is also a fourth class conditional sentence, but there is no complete example of that in the New Testament. So for our purposes right now, we'll just use first, second, and third. So the first class conditional sentences, there are about 300 of them in the New Testament. Okay, I might just mention the granddaddy of researchers on conditional sentences in New Testament Greek studies is a guy named Boyer, who wrote journal articles on every kind of conditional sentence. And so the footnote here is to Boyer's journal article called First Class conditional sentence. Now, the meaning of that is it expresses a simple logical connection. If the protasis is true, then the apodosis is also true. Okay? No statement is made as to whether or not the protasis is indeed true. Sometimes it is true and sometimes it is false. In other instances, the truth or falsity of the statement is undetermined. But, this is the important part, in a first-class conditional sentence, it can often be said that the protasis is assumed to be true for purposes of argument. Okay? We'll come down here to the second-class conditional sentence. There are only 47 examples of second-class conditional sentences in the New Testament. As I highlight this footnote, you will see also a journal article written by Boyer on second-class conditions. And so as you do some work in EBSCOhost or wherever you search out journal articles concerning conditional sentences, Boyer is the foremost authority. In second-class conditional sentences, as we saw in the chart, the protasis is introduced by the conditional particle e with a verb in the secondary tense form indicative, that is a past tense form. The apodosis is linked sometimes by the postpositive particle on with a verb in the secondary tense form indicative mood. Now, this footnote will probably say you don't have to have that on. The particle on is omitted in a few rare instances. In such instances, the second-class conditional condition can be distinguished from the first class only by a sense of context. I would say that is a true statement. I think it may be a little more common than what Decker is leading on. And so the thing to remember is in the protasis you've got e with a past tense indicative. In the apodosis you've got a past tense indicative form, and sometimes you've got that particle on. Now, if you've got the particle on is there, it's a no-brainer. It is a second-class conditional sentences. You can see down here first-class conditions also introduce the protasis with e, but the apodosis never ever has on. So let's scroll down to the meaning. Second-class condition is stated as contrary to fact, where the speaker believes the statement to be contrary to fact. In some instances, the New Testament speaker is wrong. The apodosis states what would have been true if the protasis were true. And so this formula is, if X, which I believe to be false, had been true, then Y would have been true. Let's look at this example, John 8:42. If God were your Father, you would have loved me. Now notice we've got the E in the protasis. We've also got the verb ein, which is a secondary tense or past tense indicative in the protasis. The apodosis starts with agapate, and we've got the presence of that particle on, which makes it a no-brainer. If God were your Father, and I'm assuming that to be false, then you would have loved me. Okay? And so that's the condition contrary to fact. Third-class conditional sentences, there are approximately 275 third-class conditions in the New Testament. As I look at this footnote, once again, see it's an article written by Boyer on third and fourth class conditions. Remember that I've stated that there is no complete fourth class conditional sentence found in the New Testament. The meaning is, with the use of the subjunctive mood, which expresses the idea of potentiality, the third class condition is the condition of potential fulfillment, which is of necessity in the future if it is fulfilled. it suggests that there is some measure of uncertainty regarding the future fulfillment of the condition. In reality, many times there will be little difference in meaning between a first and a third-class condition. And sometimes you will not be able to detect that at all. Usually you will not be able to detect it by an English translation. You would need to look at the Greek text to see that that is example. Here we've got an example, John 8:51. If, notice, this is the if that expects a subjunctive mood verb, which is right here. If anyone should keep my word, by no means will he see death. Okay? And so if anyone keeps my word, just by that English translation, you would not be able to distinguish whether that is a first-class conditional sentence with E and an indicative, or this example of the third-class conditional sentence. Okay, now, fourth-class conditional sentences, notice that there are no instances of this as far as a complete protasis and apodosis in the New Testament. Most of the examples that we'd find would be from the Septuagint. A fourth-class condition has a protasis introduced by E, followed by a verb in the optative mood. You might remember the optative mood in the Koine period was falling out of use. There are only 68 optative verbs in the entire New Testament. And so the fourth-class condition presents an assumption of a possibility for the sake of argument. It is more remote than either a first or a third-class condition, and the remoteness there comes from the optative mood. An example in the New Testament is not a complete example, okay? You can see we've got E and we've got this verb in the optative. If you should suffer on account of righteousness, and then in the apodosis we just have the word blessed. We understand it to mean you are. And so this is the most complete example of fourth-class condition in the New Testament. It's considered to be incomplete because there's no explicit verb in the apodosis. There's a verbless clause, este, that is, you plural are, is assumed. Okay. I've got some examples from the Septuagint, but that's the main information that I wanted to get. And so some key things to know. What is a protasis? You should be able to define that in your own word. What is an apodosis? Which part of a conditional statement is in the main clause? Okay. And you should be able at least to analyze conditional sentences based on the chart. Now, informal conditions. Informal conditions, this is chapter 31, use various syntactical structures that do not employ an explicit if-then construction, as is found in the four classes of formal conditions. So it's informal if we do not have a conditional particle, which would be either the E or the aeon, okay? But condition can certainly be implied from the context. And so we'll look at this informal conditions involving adverbial participles. Now, I made a note to this heading to bring to your memory something that I brought to you when we were discussing participles, namely a nuance that the participle can carry with it, which is informed by context. It's not part of the participle system, but you remember this little chant, TMM PRAC. Time, manner means triple C. One of the C's means conditional. And so we'll look at this example. Notice we do not have a formal conditional particle. We have neither an E with an indicative, nor do we have an aeon with a subjunctive. And so this translation, Galatians 6:9, in due time we will reap, not giving up. And so the context lends itself to understand that we're talking about if we do not give up, then we will reap. Okay? Once again, informal conditions using a participle. Participle here, not giving up. So if we do not give up, we will reap. Okay. Informal conditions involving an imperative. Okay. Once again, as an informal condition, we will not have one of the conditional particles that mean if. Okay. Matthew 11:28. We'll just look at the English. Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. That's a very little translation of that. Now, this statement is equivalent to the following condition. If you come to me, see that if, the conditional particle is kind of implied by context, then I will give you rest. Okay? Look at James 4:17. Therefore, submit to God and resist the devil, and he will flee from you. This statement is equivalent to the following condition. If you submit to God and resist the devil, then he will flee. And so we've got this conditional sentence which is implied with the use of the imperative. Informal conditions involving indefinite relative pronouns. Now, the indefinite relative pronoun will involve ostis or maybe os an. Ostis would be, os means who, ostis means whoever, and this os an means the same thing. And so either form. Matthew 5:39. But I say to you, do not resist the evil person, but if anyone, notice that's in italics because we do not have the particle for if, the conditional particle, but if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, then turn the other to him also. Okay? Look at the Greek, but whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him also the other. And so the condition is implied by the use of this indefinite relative pronoun. You can look at the other instance there. Informal conditions involving indefinite pronouns. Definite pronoun, we've got the tis. You might remember that tis or tis with an acute accent over the iota is an interrogative pronoun, whereas this same word without the accent is an indefinite. And so James 5:13, here's our tis, our indefinite pronoun. Anyone among you suffering, they should pray. Anyone is cheerful, they should sing psalms. In this example, there is no conditional particle, normally translated as if, but it is the context that lends the idea of an informal condition. Now, the last thing we're going to look at in this chapter is that of direct and indirect discourse. Some definitions here. Direct discourse is the reporting of someone's statement, or sometimes thought, with some indication that the words are given as originally spoken. In English, we would do that by offsetting quotation marks, and whatever is in the quotation marks we would take as a direct verbatim statement. Indirect discourse is the reporting of someone's statement as though in such a way that the content is preserved, but the exact words are not recorded. And so I believe that just by looking at context, you can read the English examples there, you will be able to see what that looks like. In Greek, however, let's just look at this direct discourse. Section 31.18, direct discourse is usually easy to identify since it is almost always introduced with a verb of speaking that may be supplemented with a participle either before or after the main verb. For example, he said, or saying, or having answered, he said. This sounds redundant in English, but is very normal Greek style. Okay? It is also common, more so in some writers than others. Mark, for example. By the way, Decker did his doctoral dissertation on the Gospel of Mark, and so he is quite an important expert on the Greek text of Mark. I might just mention that in the Baylor Handbook, the Greek New Testament, Decker is the author for the Baylor Handbook, the Greek New Testament, over the Gospel of Mark, which entails 2 volumes. Okay? Mark is the shortest of all the Gospels, and yet in the Baylor Handbook, authored by Decker, we have 2 volumes on Mark. And so more common in some writers to use a conjunction following the verb of speaking, typically oti. Now, oti can mean that, since, or because, but in this situation, the oti would introduce what we would understand to be a direct quotation. It functions just kind of like comma, open quote, then we have the direct discourse, and then we would understand in English we would need closing quotation mark. Indirect discourse is not always as easy to identify, in part because it can be constructed somewhat differently from the equivalent construction in English. And so one of the things that we will note here, let me show what I had highlighted. The original statement, "It will be too stuffy." Notice that is a statement talking about something that is happening in the future. As we would recreate that in indirect discourse, let's say the person who said this is named Mary, spelled M-E-R-R-Y. Indirect discourse, we would have Mary said it would be too stuffy. And so will be too stuffy in the original statement. We move backwards when we do this in English, and we will use said, which is a past tense verb, and would be, which is a conditional. Notice the original statement here. I am interested in history and geography, present tense. He gave out that he was interested in history and geography. I'm showing that the original statement here is in the present, and in indirect discourse, when it is referred to in English, we move it back a tense. Present tense, past tense. Okay? Next statement, I am thinking of writing a book. Present tense. And in direct discourse, we'll move it back a tense in English. He said, past tense, that he was thinking, past tense, of writing a book. And so that's the way indirect discourse happens in English. Now, by comparing the English examples of indirect discourse given above, you can observe 2 types of changes. First, the tense of the verb is changed when a statement is placed in indirect discourse. The tense is backshifted, that is, pushed back 1 step in time. In Greek, however, that does not happen. In indirect discourse in Greek, the Greek verb will not backshift it, but will rather retain the same tense as the original statement. Okay? And as you begin to read the New Testament, you will be able to see that. The last thing that I want to bring to your attention, section 31.21, is indirect questions, where we have an interrogative particle like tis or osos. In the Greek language, we don't always have to use that in a text that will have the punctuation mark of a question. We can do it in an indirect sense. Mark 15:44 is given. Pilate wondered if already he had died. Pilate was surprised to hear that he was already dead. And so the original statement was, he's already dead? But when this is referred to in indirect questions, the question mark is removed. Okay? And so you can look at those examples and come to a conclusion. Now, once again, most of what I will want you to drill down on and understand out of these two chapters is found in chapter 30. But I think that you will find this pretty easy to recognize when we're working with the Greek text. So that's what I've got for you today, and I look forward to seeing you on Thursday.